government bodies, by activists and by community members, but also by living and non-living entities who live in the forest. And added to that, we felt it would be important for us to have a conversation with the people who are deeply involved in processes through which the idea of the forest and questions of access to infrastructure are being shaped. So that is what this is. Across this whole 7-day period, we have a series of events that are all asking these questions in different ways and often in different mediums. Today is day 3, and today we start off a 3-day conversation that is loosely based on the Adivasi slogan Jal, Jungle and Zameen. So the first day we start off with the idea of the jungle, looking at how the forest itself is imagined. The second day we look at the idea of Zameen in terms of who owns the forest. And the third day is looking at Jal, loosely looking at how people access infrastructure within the forest. After that, I'll tell you about the events after that, but they're really interesting collaborations that are there. But for now, I think I'll leave you with the fact that this is the first of such conversations that we hope will provoke some sort of dialogue, interaction, and some enlightenment for us about what the forest is. Before that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce today's Sutradhar, as it were. Is Simpreet Singh. Simpreet, give me a bio. I seem to have lost it. Sorry, I'm terrible today. Yeah.
I can do it.
No, I haven't, sorry. Yeah. Simpreet works around the intersection of arts, activism, and archives. As part of the GRIDS project, which is this project, he has been looking for the remnants of the forests in the official and not so official archives. He identifies himself as a student of the city, Mumbai. Those of us who have been working in the city of Mumbai have known Simpreet to be an integral part of many projects. And this short bio that he insists that we read only covers a small part of his vast experience in the city, and we felt it would be perfect for him to be the person who is anchoring today's conversation. So without any other Gyan from my side, I'm just moving the microphone to Simpreet's hands. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you all. It's very heartening to see you all, and I'm sure that you all are equally excited to hear our panelists and about their life journey, and in life journey specifically how they have engaged with the question of forest and nature, and particularly in context of a city. And as you can see, that it's a very multi-perspective and diverse practice-based panelist with us. So I won't hold you for long, and I won't be talking about forest and nature in the city. But what I thought was, I'll share a Buddhist fable from the text Titha Sutta. And there are many versions of it, but I will be sharing the most unoriginal version of that and the brief version of that. The story goes that a group of 8 people heard that a strange animal called an elephant had been brought in the town, and none of them were aware of what an elephant is like and what was the shape and form of it. So, and also it was that they couldn't see. So they could only touch and feel, and on the basis of that, they tried to describe that animal. So the first one whose hand landed on that trunk said that this being seems like a thick snake. For another whose hand reached its ear, it seemed like a kind of a fan. And the person who could feel the side of the elephant said that it's a wall. And the story goes on. In a nutshell, the elephant was, from their experience, always a part and not as a whole. So they only described what they could experience. I might be wrong to say, but I will still say that in a way, we all those who are present in this room, we touch, live, see, feel, eat, smell, and work in and around, for and against the forest, with our own limitations and possibilities of experiences as well as practices. And this sort of a dialogue is that when we leave this room, we take something which is more than what we knew from others' perspective. not from what we already knew and trying to sort of strengthen our own belief system, but trying to see that from where the other person comes around. So in a way, it's going to be hopefully a dialogue across disciplines, subjectivities, and positions. And with that, I would just like to have a brief round of introduction for every panelist. So what we thought was, we'll have like 5 to 7 minutes for each panelist, where they can just tell like 3 or 4 the most sort of insights of their practice and experience in a forest, and then we can have another round amongst the panelists where they want to clarify or also engage with each other, and then we'll have the house open for you to come in as the 8th or the 9th or person who's trying to figure out what animal is. So first of all, I would like to introduce, not invite, but because the panelists are already here. So Prakash Goyalji, and I'm sure that everyone who's present here knows him. That way, of introduction not going to capture his work, but he has been very much an integral part of the Adivasi Hak Samvardhan Samiti and a resident of the RA colony. And on the first day, those of whom you all were here, so Ganesh Devi said that rather than talking about people who stay in the forest as forest dwellers, they are forest keepers. Forest is because they are there. So he is a forest keeper, and part of also the Save RA movement and the number of which the state has been. So he has been fighting it very strongly, and he has been part of that. So we have also Gitanji Sahu, who is a professor at the Center for Climate Change and Sustainability Studies at ASS. His research and teaching interests includes environmental jurisprudence, environmental regulation and policy, land and forest rights. He has served as member of many of the government committees of Chhattisgarh government, of the Kerala government, and he has also been very closely associated with many of the South Asia forest rights and environmental justice networks. So today we will be talking about the Forest Rights Act, and also how a little bit about how that law came into being and what are the challenges when one is seeing its implementation, just not in Mumbai but across length and breadth of the country. We have Malini Krishnakutty. She is an urban planner with experience in spatial planning in India. Over the last 2 decades, she has served as a consultant on several urban planning projects. For those who are in Mumbai know that she has been part of the regional plan 2036 for Mumbai Metropolitan Region. Currently, she is an adjunct associate professor at the Center for Urban Science and Engineering at IIT Bombay, and she has a PhD in Habitat Studies from DSS. She will be talking about how the discipline of planning generally views nature of forest in the city, and what are the disciplinary biases that come as a planner, and at the same time what are the possibilities that you still being engaged in a discipline like planning, how you can, what can be a different take of planning around nature in the city. We have then Shweta Ma, who is an architect and urban researcher and associate professor at Privya. She is a founding member of the Collective for Spatial Alternatives. It's a planning, research and advocacy collective based in Mumbai, and has worked with various communities and collectives in the city on urban policy and planning related issues. Since 2011, she has been engaged in ethnographic research focused on transformation of marine fisheries in Mumbai, and currently she is pursuing a PhD at Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Bombay. Shweta will be talking about forest as a category and what can be the multi-perspective view about forest on the basis of work she has been doing in this city. Next to Shweta is Hussain in Dorwala. He also teaches and is an urban researcher at Trivia. His research work has focused on urban politics and ideology, planning epistemology, urban history, and urban political economy. He writes frequently in the popular press on urban development planning and policy. He has been active in many social movements in Mumbai for housing rights, labor rights, sustainable mobility, environmental justice and participatory planning. He works closely with community groups through Collective for Spatial Alternatives as an action researcher and advocacy collective. He will be talking about the broader concepts and of nature and what it means to think about nature in context of the city, and how the present contestations in the city, be it around or elsewhere, are the questions of land use. Joining us next is Devi Bhanika, who is an environmentalist who started his love affair, what he calls as a love affair with the environment in mid-70s during his college days, and he has still continued. He has worked with many organizations, WWF, BNHS, or BAG, Intact, Indian Heritage Society. He has also served as member of many committees appointed by either the Bombay High Court or the Ministry of Environment and Forest and Maharashtra government. He has pioneered several successful campaigns to protect natural environment, and some of the most notable stories have been protection of mangroves, protection of the Borivali National Park, and the success in protecting over 3,500 square kilometers of forest in Vidarbha from denotification. So he will be talking about his views of a forest and his experience of the conservation efforts he has been engaged in, whether it's city or even beyond. And lastly but not the least, we have Ankush Chandan, who is an architect and urban designer, and he currently teaches at Trivia. Much of his work engages with the intersection of digital technologies and spatial mapping. In the GRIDS project, he has been involved in tracing the evolution of cartographic definitions of forest and their implications on. He has also developed the VR component of the exhibition. Those of you who just came directly here, so in the first room there is a VR video, so please have a look. It's a different, altogether a different experience. Ankush will be sharing about his experience and insights he got while working on the maps and the digital technologies, and how maps, when they are drawn, what are the anomalies that emerge due to the cartographic limitations. So I'll stop here. I know this is like long introduction, but I think that's what tells us about the density of the experiences that people are bringing on table here. So I would request and start with Prakash Goelji, and if you're comfortable here, to you can speak from here about how you want to come. I will just request the speakers to try to limit to 5 minutes, and I know you are not going to like me, but I'm going to stop. Just maybe up.
सभी को जोहार। जोहार का मतलब है कि प्रकृति की जय। मेरा नाम प्रकाश गोयल है और मैं आरे के आदिवासी विलेज से आया हूँ, जहाँ पर बहुत सारे प्राणी हैं, पक्षी हैं, पेड़ हैं, अन्य जीव हैं और बहुत सारे आदिवासी हैं। आज थोड़ा यहाँ पे मुझे बहुत अच्छा लगा कि यहाँ पे मैंने जो नज़ारा देखा कि, और मुझे उस विषय पे बोलना है, जंगल का मतलब क्या है। मुझे अभी एक बात याद है कि एक बार माल न्यूट्रिशन के ऊपर थाना जिला में माल न्यूट्रिशन था, और उसके ऊपर एक समिति आई थी उसके ऊपर अभ्यास करने के लिए कि वो उनके ऊपर रिसर्च किया जाए, उनको कुछ मदद की जाए। लेकिन वो मीटिंग कहाँ रखी थी? होटल में। वहाँ पे उन्होंने भरपेट खाया और फिर माल न्यूट्रिशन के ऊपर लोग चर्चा कर रहे थे। तो मुझे लगा कि ये ठीक से हो नहीं पाएगी। आज स्थिति कुछ वैसी ही है कि ये जंगल के बारे में हमें बोलना है, और वो भी सिटी में। हाँ, तो अगर यही प्रोग्राम अगर जंगल के बीच में होता तो मुझे आसान होता कि आपको समझाना सब जंगल मतलब क्या है। लेकिन फिर भी मुझे बहुत खुशी मिलती है कि लोग, शहर के लोग भी जंगल के बारे में, पर्यावरण के बारे में इतना गहराई से सोचते हैं, जिन्होंने यहाँ पे जंगल ही खड़ा किया है, जो आरे का जो मैप बना है, नेशनल पार्क आरे, ये सब। और जंगल क्या है ये बताना मुझे अच्छा लगेगा, क्योंकि लोगों को लगता है खाली पेड़ पौधे या कुछ लेपर्ड या अन्य जीव मतलब जंगल होता है। मुझे नहीं लगता वैसे जंगल है। दिन में शायद वो कम हिलता हो, लेकिन रात में अन्य जीव होते, छोटे छोटे जीव होते, बाहर आते हैं। और हम सोचते हैं ना कि हम विकास के लिए जो अलग अलग प्रोजेक्ट वहां पे आते हैं, तो हमें लगता है कि क्या चंद पेड़ का नष्ट हो जाएंगे, उससे मतलब नुकसान क्या होगा। वैसी बात नहीं है। हम जानते हैं कि खाली पेड़ नहीं है वहां पर, उस पेड़ के ऊपर जब एक पेड़ कटता है तो मेरे हिसाब से पेड़ के ऊपर बहुत सारे स्पाइडर होते हैं या फिर उनके छोटे छोटे जीव होते हैं। और अन्य जीव तो ऐसे होते हैं उनका भी उन जंगल के ऊपर, उन पेड़ के ऊपर उनका ही अधिकार, लेकिन हम लोग अभी मालिक बनने जा रहे हैं। हम खुद को मालिक समझते हैं, हमें दूसरों के बारे में। इसलिए तो अब हसदेव का जंगल भी नष्ट होने जा रहा है। वहां पे हसदेव बहुत सारे पेड़ कट रहे हैं और वहां के आदिवासी लोग वहां पे संघर्ष कर रहे हैं। और मैं देखता हूं कि आदिवासी और जो पर्यावरण प्रेमी वो संघर्ष करते हैं, आवाज उठाते हैं, लेकिन सांस तो सब लोग लेते हैं। मेरा कहना यही है कि जंगल को बचाने के लिए उन सभी लोगों का हाथ चाहिए जो सांस लेते हो, जो जीवित है। हम जानते हैं कि हमें सांस पेड़ों से मिलती है, लेकिन वैसा नहीं होता। हमें भी, मेरे घर में बहुत सारे सर्टिफिकेट है, कुछ ट्रॉफी है। हमें ग्रीन वॉरियर्स या फिर जंगल बचाने के लिए आपने अच्छा काम किया है उनके सर्टिफिकेट मिलते हैं। ये नहीं चाहिए सर्टिफिकेट। बहुत सारे जंगल ही आदिवासी बचाएंगे, पर्यावरण प्रेमी बचाएंगे, हम सर्टिफिकेट देंगे, उसको सत्कार करेंगे। वैसे नहीं चाहिए। हमें लगता है कि आप भी वहां पर आप बोलना चाहिए। आप जैसे सोशल मीडिया उसके माध्यम से लड़ाई ऐसे नहीं होती कि वहां जंगल में यहां से भी लड़ सकते हैं, तो ये सब बचेगा। क्योंकि अभी उनको तो खाली विकास दिखता है और अभी विनाश दिखता है उसमें। मैंने कुछ गाने भी लिखे जो यहाँ पे 27 तारीख को नया हमारा गाना भी यहाँ पे पेश होने, रिवॉल्वर के गाना आपने सुना होगा। जब संघर्ष करते हैं हमें लोगों से निकालना है, इसलिए मैंने वो गाना लिखा था कि माणूस म्हणून आम्हाला सारं करायचं, आज नाही उद्याला मरायचं, मग कशाला मागे सरायचं। उसमें एक है कि जंगल असे आमची आई, रक्षणाचे जीव जाई, झाडं तुम्ही तोडून टाकता, त्याग आम्हा काय मागा। जंगल के बाद हमारे यहाँ पे रक्षाबंधन होती है ना, वैसे हम वृक्ष बंधन भी करते हैं। अगर हमारे यहाँ पे मैंने देखा कि 1,80,00,000 हमारी पॉपुलेशन है मुंबई की, और उसमें जो आधी तो महिलाएं हैं, तो अगर हर एक महिला ने एक पेड़ को अगर भाई बना लिया और उसको राखी बांध दिया और उन्होंने ठान लिया कि मैं भैया मैं आपको नहीं काट देती हूँ, तो मुझे लगता है कि कोई पेड़, एक भी पेड़ नहीं कटेगा। तो जरूरी है, बरोबर कि नहीं। तो हसदेव का जंगल अभी नष्ट हो रहा है, तो उसके बारे में हमें लिखना है। हमें जितना चाहे, जैसा कि ऐसे ये जो प्रोग्राम है मुझे बहुत आज अच्छा लगा कि ऐसे मैं चाहूंगा कि हमारे ज्यादा से ज्यादा लोग, कि शहर के लोग भी हमारे बारे में कितना सोचने लगे। होता यह है कि कोई प्रोजेक्ट आता है ना, तो लोगों को लगता है, उनको लगता है कि हम लोग आदिवासियों का पुनर्वसन करके उनका विकास करेंगे, उनको अच्छे घर देंगे, उनको बिजली देंगे। हमें नहीं चाहिए वो सब, क्योंकि विकास उनके हाथ में नहीं है। मैंने एक पॉलिटिशियन से बोला था कि देखिए हमारा घर बहुत बड़ा है और मेरे फैमिली मेंबर्स बहुत हैं। अगर आप हमें एक घर के बदले कहीं बिल्डिंगों में एक घर देना चाहेंगे, वहां नहीं बैठेंगे मेरे लोग, क्योंकि मेरे पास कहीं स्नेक है, कहीं बर्ड्स है और लेपर्ड भी तो है जो हमारे घर में हमेशा आता है। मेरे कुछ वीडियो आपको मेरे व्हाट्सएप में है, फेसबुक पे देखो, मेरे घर के अंदर वो लेपर्ड आके झाँक रहा है। मेरे लड़के की शादी में मंडप में आया था। ये हमारे फैमिली मेंबर्स है और ये नहीं रह सकते वहां पर। हम लोग एडजस्ट कर सकते हैं, लेकिन वो कैसे करेंगे, उनके बारे में कौन सोचेगा। उनके बारे में देखिए, उनका कोई अलग से मुख्यमंत्री या उनका कोई अलग से पंतप्रधान भी नहीं है। हमारे मुख्यमंत्री उनको ही संभालना है, लेकिन उनका कोई नहीं, क्योंकि वो वोटर्स नहीं है। तो ये सब बात हमें रखनी होगी। और मैं जंगल के ऊपर तो बहुत बोलना है, क्योंकि जंगल हमारे सांस है। देखिए हमारा हृदय बोलते हैं ना, वो है। हाँ, तो वो हमें सबने अगर सब लोग हम ठान ले और एक साथ आए। अभी मेरी प्रमिला जी मेरी बीवी है यहाँ पे, जो मेट्रो कासिर के जो संघर्ष है उसमें 2 दिन जेल में भी रही, और वो चाहती है कि वो खुश थी उस दिन के जंगल बचाने के लिए मुझे 100 जेल में जाना पड़ा तो नहीं जाऊंगी। उनके ऊपर फिल्म भी बनी है कि आरिफ वागिन शेरनी है वागिन की। अगर वहां पे अगर आपको पेड़ अभी काटना हो तो शेरनी से पहले। और मुझे अच्छा लगता है कि वो जो फिल्म बनी उसको इंग्लैंड में उसको कुछ अवार्ड भी मिला, वो जो BBC न्यूज पे दिखाया, और वो फिल्म अभी 26 तारीख को यहाँ पे दिखाई जाएगी, तो आप जरूर देखना। जोहार जिंदाबाद।
धन्यवाद प्रकाश जी। मतलब जैसे कि उन्होंने एक सवाल और एक तरह से चुनौती हमारे सामने रखी है कि ये सिर्फ अगर हम जंगल में रह रहे हैं और पर्यावरण प्रेमी है तो क्या सिर्फ हमारा ही ये काम है? तो ऐसा नहीं है, और शायद इसीलिए हम सब यहाँ पर है। कुछ ऐसी एक सोच रख सकते हैं, चाहे आप जितनी हिम्मत हमें ना हो, लेकिन जरूर कि आपसे प्रभावित होके या इंस्पायर होके जरूर हम उस रास्ते पर चलने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं और ज्यादा समझ लाने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं। तो अभी मैं गीतांजलि से रिक्वेस्ट करूंगा कि वो थोड़ा ये फॉरेस्ट राइट एक्ट जो है वो क्या है और किस तरह से क्यों लाया गया, उसके पीछे की सोच क्या थी, लेकिन आज उसका जो अमल हो रहा है तो उसमें क्या कठिनाइयां।
Thank you, Simpreet and Ron, for this opportunity. मैं हिंदी में बोल सकता हूँ, लेकिन ये हैदराबाद हिंदी है। I spent a lot of time in Hyderabad and Bangalore, so I'll prepare to speak English mainly. I think Ron was talking about the idea of forest, and you wanted me to speak about the Forest Rights Act. But to talk about the idea of forest, we need to understand the historical context. Today morning, when I was going through some of the Supreme Court judgments about forest governance, it is very surprising, despite so many attempts, we don't have a definition about forest. We have a definition for forest cover, forest area, but there is no definition what does forest mean. But there are several ideas which are around forest. Now, to understand this, we need to go back to those historical forces as well as historical events which shape the idea of forest. Like the idea of India, the idea of forest is also plural. It is not the idea of forest that is shaped and reshaped by two dominant narratives. One dominant narrative is the narrative that is created, popularized by state and market forces. For them, forest is always about for production purposes. The other dominant narrative is the exclusionary conservation idea, which believes that forest is for a particular class, a particular group of people, where the idea of conservation is considered sacrosanct. There are no other values to be attached. Now, why these two ideas dominate the forest discourse, and what led to the evolution of forest rights act? In 2 minutes, I'll explain these two dominant narratives. If you look back the pre-colonial period, that is 1757, the communities across the regions, they had pre-existing rights, and these pre-existing rights include all types of rights, economy, including hunting, the cultural pre-existing rights. But from 1750, history was history of externalization of decision making, and also history of extraction of resources in an unsustainable manner. And one expected in the post-independence period, the newly independent state will correct millions of people in the name of larger national interest. But somehow the independent India decided to reinforce those colonial rules and regulations. There was no significant departure what we had those colonial legislations like the Indian Forest Act of 1927. Okay. So we continued with those colonial legislations, and these legislations never recognized and late 60s and early 70s environmental movements, including Chipko movement, subsequently movements across the country, challenge the dominant narrative that state has the right over forests, and this right is only for forest policy of 1952. They kept a category called national forest, where the emphasis was diverting forest for highways, infrastructure, but there was no reference to recognize those traditional rights. So these movements challenged, and by 70s, narrative can control and appropriate resources. Another narrative evolved, and which continues today. That is the conservation narrative, and I'm sure many of you must have read Walter Fernandez's writings. He has written extensively on displacement and development in India, where he talked about 60 million people were from 1947 to 1990 pre-liberalization period, and a new trend emerged after 70s, where you witnessed conservation-induced displacement. So you have 54 tiger reserves, hundreds of national parks, more than 500 sanctuaries, where even the Wildlife Protection Act recognizes that settlement of rights is sanctuaries are declared. Despite having those provisions, we don't have a single example in the country where we could say that people are happily uprooted. So the conservation narrative is also shaping forest policy, but thanks to the change in the political culture in the later 80s, India witnessed coalition politics, and coalition politics also brings several new actors to the political arena. And these actors represented multiple vulnerable and subaltern groups, whether it is tribal parties in Jharkhand or Gujarat. These parties, along with hundreds of forest rights groups and networks, campaign across the country that forest dwellers' rights should be regularized. And that is how the discourse around forest rights began, which challenged these two dominant narratives, that forest is only for production purpose and the exclusionary conservation idea. And in the late 90s and subsequently in the early 2000 period, when several campaigns happened across the country, they also challenged many of these misinterpretations done by especially the Forest Department. As I say, in Wildlife Protection Act there is provision to settle the rights before you relocate. But these groups challenged, and fortunately there was also a very conducive political atmosphere, which for the first time recognized that historical injustice happened to these forest dwelling communities. In fact, when we read the preamble of the Forest Rights Act, I think one of the unique legislations, perhaps the only legislation where the preamble begins with a statement that we have done injustice to the forest dwelling communities, and this is the time to undo that historical injustice by recognizing those rights. And there are several organizations which are trying to sort of mislead, saying Forest Rights Act is a land grabbing act, which is not. It is not a land distribution act like what we had land reforms in West Bengal, Kerala, or many other parts. It is an act to recognize which were taken away during colonial period and continued also in the post-independence period. Now this act, I have 1 minute, and this act which was enacted in 2006, there are very and some of these provisions recognize that forest dwelling communities and other traditional forest dwellers, because when the bill was drafted, it was scheduled tribes rights for forest resource and lands. But thankfully many of these organizations also say forest is not just about tribal rights, but there are also other traditional their rights need to be recognized. So this is how the several tribes and other traditional forest dwellers Recognition of Rights Act came into force on 1st January 2008. Almost now close to 17 years of implementation, but unfortunately several attempts have been made not to recognize rights. Across the country, if you see, there are variations in implementation of the act. But what you see in this variation, there are several forces, and these forces include both state and as well as city dwellers who consider tribals are encroachers, who considers like what we witness in cities, slum dwellers are considered as encroachers, and many attempts were made also in the court of law, where petitions have been filed to challenge the constitutional validity of FRA. We don't know what is going to be the outcome of those petitions, and I'm also one of the co-petitioners along with another 8 academicians in the Supreme Court, where we challenged when the Supreme Court gave an order to evict millions of tribals on the ground that they have encroached on the land. Now the case is pending in the court, but what we need to understand, there is a sort of a dominant coalition which is trying to misinterpret the significance of forest rights. It is not an act to distribute land, and there are also several best practices across the country. As I said, I was telling Simpreet, I'm an odd man out in this panel because I don't work in forest and city. Most of the times I spend in either in Vidarbha region, Gadchiroli or Kalahandi district of Odisha, where we see how community members have managed the forest in a sustainable way, and we have done also several comparative studies to see forest managed by forest department and forest managed by the community, and what is the significance of the outcome of the forest managed by community members. So they are more sustainable, and livelihood enhancement has also happened, and we see there is a reverse migration happening because of the economic value that is now directly going to forest department. So I'll end by saying this, that when we talk about the idea of forest, it is not just about what Prakash Ji was telling. It's not the idea of only forest for production or forest for conservation. Like when the RA colonies campaign was going on, and that was, I think, the only experience I have in the city, though that was very unclear, where we witnessed how state was reluctant to recognize forest rights in cities, and that is also reasons I had a long discussion with Prakash Ji. Like when we talked about RI colony movement, again we saw and witnessed the city dwellers were more concerned about the idea of conservation. And there were many photographs during the RI colony, people were hugging the tree, but not a single photograph when somebody talked about those 27 hamlets in RI colony, where basic facilities are not there. It is the financial capital, and where one of the richest states, but you don't have basic amenities in RI colony. So I think as city dwellers we need to introspect what kind of conservation idea we are talking about, and whether this conservation idea is inclusive or not. Thank you.
Thank you for very briefly but very insightful sort of historical trajectory about the crux of the matter, that what is a forest. And I think we hope that I'm not confident, because if legal luminaries have not been able to tackle with the question like what is a forest in a law, or maybe the weaknesses that sort of benefits them, but definitely we take this discussion ahead, and also maybe question and answer के some of the best practices जो आपने बोला कि उसके बारे में भी बात शायद थोड़ा कर पाएंगे. From ये एक कानून के परिप्रेक्ष्य से थोड़ा प्लानिंग के परिप्रेक्ष्य की तरफ बढ़ेंगे, क्योंकि ये भी एक इंटरेस्टिंग है कि एज अ प्लानर कैसे एक फॉरेस्ट को देखा जाता है, और शायद मुंबई और ऐसे 2-3 ही शहर हैं जहाँ पे शहर के अंदर एक डिमार्केटेड ऑफिशियल फॉरेस्ट है. तो एज अ प्लानर के आप मालिनी, एज अ प्लानर, हाउ डू यू डील विद दैट एलिफेंट, एंड व्हाट आर द चैलेंजेस एंड व्हाट आर द इनसाइट्स दैट
So thanks for this opportunity to come here and reflect on what it means, what it means for planning and the planning practice. What does it mean as a practitioner to think about the environment, and how do we as planners look at forest as an entity. So there are two things I wanted to say. First is that I'm talking first about what is the typical kind of urban planning practice. How do planners, when they prepare the development plan or regional plan, how do they look at the environment and what is that typical practice? And then I will spend a little time talking about as a critical researcher and a practitioner, kind of talking about what are kind of disciplinary biases that are there within the practice of planning, and maybe some ways ahead. There are some examples of how we could look at the environment differently as we think about urban planning. So, firstly, when we think about urban planning, it's a state practice, it's a state profession, and it is bound by this regulatory framework, of the law, the Town Planning Act. And so the planner typically, when the environment is the last thing on the agenda, right? It's not this. So what is the planner trying to do? It's trying to regulate the use of land. How do you build on it? How do you develop in future for the next 20 years? And typically, then what happens is everything that the law has put down, in terms of what is there, what is the environment. So it is the Forest Conservation Act, the protected areas. So that boundary, because we are talking about a finite piece of land, those jurisdiction. So the planning is confined to the urban, and as in the case of RA or any of these areas within the planning, the planner will first look at boundary, which is controlled by which act, right? So there is the planner will specify as no development is determined by what the planner will. That's the end of that. We'll set aside sanctuaries for anything that is protected by law will be set aside. The mangroves till mangroves were included in forests, it's not looked at. Okay, it's open to develop. Once there is a law which protects a particular piece of land, then the planner will take that on board. So that's where there is no development possible. So similarly, the CRZ. So you have an act, then the coast becomes something. So it is, the entire urban planning practice is something which is governed by the laws of the land, and that's how the planner typically will look at, put aside those areas, and if there is no act, no law, no Supreme Court ruling which says you have to do X, Y, Z, then the planner typically will then not get into that area. That's the standard practice. So, that's how, like, whether it's RA or whether it's any forest, that and closely tied to that is practice is very much something that is so the as well as urban planning, they are founded on property rights. So who owns this land? Papers, the drawings, to how both the law protecting property rights, private property. What I would in terms of typical practice, and I would say as someone, if I was going to be as a critical practitioner, as someone who's been researching the kind of foundations of India, I think it's very similar to what we heard about the Forest Acts. We have a practice which has been handed down, which has come to us from the UK, and we have borrowed a little eclectically from the US and other But essentially, the act itself is something word to word almost borrowed from Britain. And we, till the 70s, we have to train there, and so what the practice is very much something that is rooted in a Western practice. And we very far, and I would say that they practice, you're also not very self-reflexive. There's no need to be critical. You already know what you have to do, and you go about it. It's very much there's to kind of think about what we do as planners, and if I talk about the practice is like you have to do X, Y, Z, you get down and do it. So it's not something that actions. So you go ahead, there are standards, everything is kind of set, and you get down to do what you. And I would say therefore it's very, very an environmental basis to the plan, which you would expect, or a climate approach. These are things which are not really making their way, because the environment, it's about land, and it's about land use planning, how to use the land. It's not so much about really having a framework as a starting point. So that's the second thing I want to say. And the third thing, then, if you don't have a critical practice and you have a handed down then how do you, does it mean that planners can't do much? You think that planning is everything. Anything goes wrong in the city and the first terrible planning, there's flooding, oh God, so we're the first to get bashed as planners. And it's a very limited kind of practice, a very clearly defined land use based a practice that's only concerned about how. But having said that, and I want to end on a more hopeful note, that there have been, the planner actually can use that statutory plan to conserve, to do much more. Examples come to mind. The first, I would say, or three rather. The first is the case of the Goa Regional Plan of 2011, where 80% of the land has been put aside some kind of environmental sensitive zone. Okay, so you have eco-sensitive zone 1, 50% of it, which included not just the wildlife sanctuaries and the protected, maybe the paddy fields. Paddy fields, so you have CR, you have suddenly come into an eco-sensitive zone. Eco-sensitive zone 2, which includes eco-sensitive zone 1, also has steep slopes. Like, a lot of developers were at beautiful views. The regional plan actually then puts aside 80% of Goa conservation, and starts listing out where. So this tells you the power of the plan, that if you want, then it's a fantastic, the plan. The second one, I would say, it starts the water plan starts from micro watersheds. Because Bangalore is on a plateau, you have to conserve it as a city of lakes. So the plan starts with the smallest unit is actually then your conservation of those micro watersheds. Which areas do you build on? Which don't you build on? If you did that, you would probably not lead to this kind of disastrous floods that you're seeing across the country. So that's the second and the last thing that I want to say. Yeah, so this, there was one more, but I suddenly missing that. If my says that, in all of this, like clearly, what you see is, and I felt when I went through the exhibition here, that the map that that all of us as planners, we are maps, and the map is finally an abstract. The moment you try to draw something, the reality on the ground, and I think that's what the exhibition is telling us repeatedly, that the life out there is too intricate, and how do you capture that that life? And when you draw a map, whatever map you draw, you might draw it in so many different ways, but and I think the only way forward, whether it's to plan or what we do, how do we, as we go ahead, is to involve people and to really have a bottom-up participatory process, both to critique the planning practice as well as places we create as we go ahead. Yeah? Thank you.
I think, as you said, that in the planning, the different problems. We have the 73rd and 74th situation, but second doesn't happen, and I think that we engage with such processes and pointing about the map, how much real or abstract it is, and I think in this engagement around maybe the map man of this project, he would like to, and about these lines that are on the paper, and when you try to go in the field and find out like what impact they have on the lives of the yeah.
I'd like to speak about our experience of trying to understand the definitions of the forest in the city through the GRIDS project, and the three sort of critical points I'd like to talk about. Like you said, like the idea of the map is a very abstract idea, and it's also important to understand that very different stakeholders make of the forest in Bombay. If you see the maps that have been laid out, we have maps of the forest as defined by the development plans, which is the BMC. You also have the regional plan that defines the forest, which is the MMRDA, and you have external climate change, which defines the forest. All of these have very conflicting definitions and boundaries of the forest. Overlay them, it's very hard to find places where they actually overlap. They are not they're not congruent. Also, in each development plan or each the kind of definitions are present in those plans, which means what are you allowed to build, what are you allowed to do, and what you're not allowed to do. One very interesting reservation that green zone. It sounds very preservative. It sounds like it's working towards conservation. But what happens is that erstwhile NDZs, no development zones, they kind of started to allow certain kinds of practices. They started allowing certain kinds of activities to be built. For example, the green zone one, it started allowing agricultural industry, resorts, etc. in areas that were earlier no development zones. Now, they have been interpreted in very different ways to the point that now we have casting yards, huge casting yards where it was actually supposed to be a green zone, right? And that's not really the picture that comes to our mind when we say green zone. So, these sort of different bodies, these different stakeholders that prepare these maps, they come up with definitions of forests that are not always congruent, that are not always talking on the same lines. The second thing is sort of like a technocratic angle. So a very interesting thing that we found during the research was, so up until the regional plan of 96, most of the plans were made using chain link surveys. So people would go out, they would conduct chain link surveys, they would then plot it back onto paper, and that kind of change in the regional plan of '96, where digital technology was adopted. That was the first time it came into the picture, and people started using maps of forests. Existing the chain link service, and they kind of plotted it in any act of mapping, any act of plotting the map is essentially an act of and putting it on a flat plane. So that means there's got to be some kind of projection system, right? So now the projection systems that we used for chain link service for manual methods were very different that we use for GIS. So like the kind of we use a projection system called UTM, Universal Transverse Mercator, right? That's on a typical globe that you see in offices. So in that translation, the very was less. I think the original plan was somewhere around 4,300, which is in the entire MRD region, was around 4,000. And when that exact same shape was kind of plotted onto ArcGIS, it became 4,236. So we lost 130 square kilometers, God knows where, because the exact shape, the boundaries, all of that is maintained, but we lost that area, right? So that really kind of points to the fallacy of really depending on to be like our saviors, right? What also you georeference these maps, you get these development plans, you get these regional plans, you georeference them. Millimeters difference on the plan, which is at a scale of 150,000, is it acres and acres going here or there. You see quite a lot, especially in SDNP and RA, and people who say the boundary is crossing through our not realize was the case in. So there are a lot of these kind of technical hurdles as well that come into the map as this sort of sacrosanct document. Third and the last thing I'd like to talk about is so we are collecting. It was still incredibly maps or access maps that were standard. Duration of the project, when we were actually collecting these materials, we found a lot of maps in the notified area, which is the notified area of the SGNP as demarcated by the Forest and Climate Change. That one single map different versions. So anytime you would find a project drawing of, let's say, a building or the erstwhile metro car shed site, the boundary definition that you see of the notified area is very different. And it's very strange because that should be one unified document which should be accessible to everyone. Let's say you talk about accessing the development plan, which is sort of like the backbone of planning in the city, right? Even now, if you go to the BMC website, to access a map, firstly to find out what document number applies to your site, is a task in itself, right? There is a key map that you have. Some of the students are here, they're laughing because we've asked them to do that a lot and they've had a lot of trouble doing that. Even just to find a key map, to find what map comes where is it available, is a nightmare. You go into the BMC website, there is a Windows XP level folder where it's incredibly hard to find these maps, right? I paid my electricity bill today. It took 3 clicks, literally 3 clicks for me to see the amount that I have to pay and to transfer that amount into Tata Power or Adani Power's bank accounts, right? How is it that something that is as fundamental to the city as a development plan is so out of reach for the everyday man? It is a little jarring, it's a little scary as well, because it is in this confusion that a lot of these anomalies that you see of buildings being allowed in places where they shouldn't be allowed and all of that happens. So I think one thing that's evidently clear throughout this research is the fact that if we are to depend on maps, and that's probably one of the most pragmatic ways of delineation that we have, if that is to continue, if we are to rely on maps as our sort of definition of what a forest is, we need to make sure that there is one sort of window where you are able to access it, and that all of these different, so SGNP alone, the Sanjay Gandhi National Park is sort of delimited by three or four different development plan bodies. There is the BMC, there is the Vasai Virar Municipal Corporation, there is Mira Bhayantar, there is Thane, and the definition, the reservations in each of these is different. What is a forest? What's a green area? Plan is a recreational area in the same sort of extent of the forest, right? So unified sort of each of these mean, and we definitely need better access to these maps, and they need to be made available. UDRI had sort of started this whole project where they were putting up all of these development plans of Bombay online. The plan of 2014-34 is not available on the site anymore. That was a remarkable sort of democratize this sort of map, and I think we need to really further that. We need to really come together as a city and demand that we have access to these when they life. He's kind of talking about the kind of effects that these official state imagination, and it is extremely important that we start demanding these rights. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you, and also invitation for those who have not seen the exhibition. There is a particular object which talks about these drawing of boundaries and how Adivasi family is trying boundary will be and what all these practices would be. And also, but as an audience, and I think some of you might agree with me, is as an audience, like we started from Prakash ji telling कि जंगल सिर्फ पेड़ नहीं होता है, and while we have reached to Ankush, and it's all about boundaries and lines on the maps from the to the like this satellite based, and in the sense the unfolding of I think that we will not get an answer of what is forest, but like what are the different manifestations of forest is and being looked by the people, by the communities, by the authorities, and just not authorities. When we talk about authority, even the not being able to zero down on one uniform map of I think it's a long journey to go. And as we go on, I would like to invite Devi to talk about his experiences about many of the initiatives been taking around forest conservation and whether it's mangrove, the Sanjay Gandhi National Park.
Good evening, everybody. First of all, I'm very glad to be here. I was actually inclined not to come today, but I'm happy I made it. See, first of all, let me begin by saying that the people, right? The forest department is just the custodian of the forest. So let's get that very clear. Secondly, there's a lot of controversy about who forests are meant for and what is supposed to be a forest and so on and so forth. And the reason why there is no legal definition of forest is very simple. Because forest does not just mean trees. We're actually talking about the definition of forest. So grasslands are forests. Can you stop that?